How could a woman born to be a pawn end up as the most powerful person in the room? Why did some queens flourish, command respect, and die in their own beds, while others, equally intelligent and well-born, ended their days in a cold stone tower? What was the secret language of survival in a world where a single misstep, a misplaced word, or a forgotten face could mean utter ruin? It wasn't just about politics or producing an heir. The skills that kept a queen alive were often the ones nobody ever wrote down in a history book. They were learned in the shadows, practiced in whispers, and perfected under the constant, unforgiving gaze of 1,000 jealous eyes. At number 20, how could a queen say no without losing her head? A queen in the 16th century might receive over 50 formal petitions in a single day. The average time a courtier was willing to wait for a favor before turning resentful was less than a month. Declining a powerful duke's request for land could result in a conspiracy within a fortnight. The art of refusal was maybe the most underrated skill a queen could possess. It sounds simple, you just say no. But in the intricate web of a royal court, a direct no was like throwing a stone. The ripples could capsize your entire ship. Every person asking for something, from a high-ranking noble wanting a government post to a distant cousin needing a debt paid, believed they were owed a yes. To them, the queen's power and treasure were infinite. Her refusal wasn't just a practical decision, it was a personal insult. So queens had to develop a whole vocabulary of non-refusals. They couldn't say no, but they couldn't always say yes. This meant mastering the art of the strategic delay. A queen would receive a petition with great seriousness. She would praise the petitioner for their loyalty and wisdom. Then she would say the matter required deep consideration. She needed to consult her counsel. She needed to pray on it. She needed to review the treasury accounts. This bought her time. Sometimes it bought her enough time for the situation to change on its own. The petitioner might find another solution, or a more pressing crisis would emerge that made the original request seem trivial. And Elizabeth I of England was a master of this. For decades, she was pressured to marry, a yes to any suitor, whether from Spain, France, or within her own kingdom, would have angered all the others. A no would have turned a potential ally into a definite enemy, so she said neither. She entertained proposals. She exchanged portraits and letters. She allowed ambassadors to think they were making progress. She kept everyone hoping, and therefore she kept them on her side. She turned the marriage question, a massive political problem, into her greatest diplomatic tool for over 20 years, all by avoiding a simple yes or no. Another technique was to deflect. A queen would agree that the petitioner's request was valid and important, but she would explain a prior commitment or a more urgent matter had to be addressed first. She would frame it not as a refusal, but as a postponement. Lord Essex, your request for the wine monopoly is a fine one, and your service merits it, she might say, but we must first settle the Irish situation. Your expertise there is invaluable. This made the refusal sound like a compliment. It redirected the nobles' energy and made them feel important, even as their request was being quietly shelved. Sometimes the best way to say no was to make it impossible to say yes. A queen could attach such difficult or expensive conditions to a request that the petitioner would be forced to withdraw it themselves. They wanted a title, certainly, but it would come with the responsibility of funding a new fort on the border. They wanted a position at court, of course, but they would first need to undertake a long and dangerous diplomatic mission. This way, the queen wasn't the one saying no. The circumstances were. It was a clever way to maintain goodwill while conceding nothing. This required a deep understanding of the person making the request. The queen had to know their finances, their ambitions, and their fears to craft a condition that was perfectly tailored to be unacceptable to them. It was a high-stakes psychological game played with land, titles, and power. The cost of losing wasn't just a political setback. It was the slow, steady erosion of her authority, one resentful courtier at a time. Number 19, could your choice of dress start a war? In 1775, Marie Antoinette wore a simple muslin dress, a chemise à la reine for a portrait. The public outcry was immense. People saw it as a rejection of the French silk industry, an insult to the weavers of Lyon, and proof of her frivolous foreign nature. A dress nearly caused a trade crisis. A queen's wardrobe could cost more than a warship. The budget for Catherine the Great's coronation gown alone could have funded a small army for a month. Fashion was not a hobby for a queen. It was a weapon. It was a language. It was a political statement broadcast to the entire court without saying a word. Every choice, from the color of a ribbon to the type of fabric, was scrutinized for hidden meaning. To survive, a queen had to become fluent in this silent, brutal language. The most basic function of a queen's dress was to project power and wealth. Sumptuous fabrics like velvet, silk, and cloth of gold, woven with precious metals, weren't just beautiful. They were a direct display of the kingdom's prosperity. When a foreign ambassador saw a queen dripping in jewels and wearing a gown that cost a fortune, they weren't just seeing a well-dressed woman. They were seeing a nation that could afford such luxury, and by extension, a nation that could afford to raise an army and go to war. Elizabeth, I famously owned over 2,000 gowns. Her portraits show her encased in elaborate structures of fabric and jewels. This wasn't vanity. It was political armor. It made her look larger than life, untouchable, and impossibly rich. It was a warning to anyone who might think of England as a weak or easy target. Color was a code. In many courts, certain colors were restricted by law to the royal family. Wearing purple, for example, could be an act of treason. A queen could use colors to send subtle messages. She might wear the colors of a specific noble house to signal her favor, instantly elevating their status. Or she could wear the colors of a rival nation's ambassador to a state dinner, a quiet gesture of goodwill, or a calculated insult, depending on the context. When Anna Cleves met Henry Vede for the first time, she wore a German-style gown. It was a statement of her identity and her heritage. But to the English court, it looked alien and clumsy. It contributed to Henry's immediate dislike of her. She had failed her first unspoken test. Queens also had to use their clothing to manage their public image. Marie Antoinette's attempt to embrace a simpler, more rustic style was a political disaster. She thought she was appearing down to earth and modern. But the people saw a queen abandoning her duty to represent the majesty of France. They didn't want a queen who looked like a milkmaid. They wanted a queen who looked like a queen. Her fashion choices were used as evidence that she was out of touch and disrespectful of French traditions. It fueled the revolutionary pamphlets that eventually led to her downfall. A queen was always on stage, and her costume had to be perfect for the role. One wrong choice could turn the audience against her. Number 18, why was knowing how to gut a deer as important as reading a treaty? A royal hunt in the 18th century could involve over 1,000 people, from nobles and beaters to dog handlers and cooks. The cost of a single day's hunt could feed a small village for a year. A queen who could not ride or who showed fear of the animals was seen as weak not just physically, but in character. The royal hunt was not a sport. It was politics on horseback. For a queen, mastering the art of the hunt was not about putting food on the table. It was about securing her place at the center of power. Court was a claustrophobic place, full of whispers and rigid etiquette. The hunt was one of the few places where the hierarchy was slightly relaxed, where real conversations could happen, and where a queen could prove her worth in a very different arena. To begin with, skill in the hunt demonstrated physical fitness and courage. A queen who could ride for hours, handle a powerful horse, and face a charging boar with a steady hand commanded a different kind of respect. It showed she had stamina and a strong constitution, which was directly linked to her ability to produce healthy heirs. Isabella of Castile was a formidable horsewoman. She often rode with her armies, covering vast distances. Her physical prowess was part of her legend. It told her nobles and her enemies that she was not a delicate flower to be sheltered in a castle. She was a leader, strong in body and in will. The hunt was also a critical networking opportunity. Away from the formal throne room, a queen could ride alongside a powerful duke or a foreign ambassador. They could speak more freely, a deal could be struck, a political alliance could be cemented, a queen who stayed behind in the castle missed these crucial informal moments of statecraft. By participating, she could overhear gossip, gauge the loyalties of her nobles, and grant favors in a less formal setting. Giving a courtier the honor of riding next to her or presenting them with a piece of the day's kill was a powerful political gesture. It built personal loyalty in a way a formal decree never could. Furthermore, the hunt was a carefully choreographed display of power and hierarchy. The rules were complex. Who got to ride where? Who was allowed to make the first strike? How the kill was divided? All of this was laden with political significance. A queen had to understand and control this choreography. If she allowed the wrong person to take a position of honor, she could inadvertently insult a more powerful noble. She had to be a master of protocol, even in the middle of a forest. By leading the hunt, she was visibly and actively leading her court. She was at the center of the action, a powerful, dynamic figure, not a passive symbol. For queens like Anne, the wife of James I, who was a passionate and skilled hunter, it was a way to carve out her own sphere of influence and command respect in a court dominated by men. Her skill with the crossbow was legendary, and it gave her a status that her political maneuvering alone might not have. Number 17, how could a queen win a battle using only a lute? In the court of Henry V, a musician's salary could be higher than that of a military captain. A single court masca, a musical and theatrical performance, could cost the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars today. A queen who was musically inept was often considered uncultured and poorly educated, a reflection on her entire family and country of origin. Music and performance were not simple pastimes for a queen. They were essential tools of diplomacy, influence, and cultural power. A queen was expected to be a patron of the arts, but more than that, she was often expected to be a performer herself. Her ability to sing, play an instrument like the lute or virginals, or dance with grace was a direct reflection of her sophistication and breeding. When a foreign ambassador came to court, they weren't just there to discuss treaties. They were there to assess the court's culture and power. A performance was part of the diplomatic ritual. A queen who could play a complex piece of music demonstrated her intelligence, discipline, and refined education. It sent a message that this was a serious, cultured court, not a backward or brutish one. Anne Boleyn was known for her musical talents. She was a gifted singer and musician, and she used these skills to charm Henry V and his court. Her performances were part of her appeal. They set her apart from her rivals and showcased her French-educated background, which was seen as the height of sophistication at the time. Music also created a space for a queen to exert personal influence. The formal settings of the court were rigid. But in the more relaxed atmosphere of a musical evening, a queen could hold a different kind of court. She could gather a circle of allies, engage in witty conversation, and build personal relationships. By leading the music, she was leading the social life of the court. She decided who to invite, what music to play, and who to honor with a request to perform. This gave her a subtle but significant form of power. She could use music to reward her friends and pointedly ignore her enemies. Furthermore, a queen's patronage of musicians and composers was a way to build a legacy and promote a national identity. By funding the creation of new music, she was shaping the cultural output of the kingdom. This was a form of soft power. The music from her court could travel across Europe, enhancing her reputation and that of her country. For Queen Elizabeth, I was a skilled musician who played the virginals. She understood the power of performance. She maintained a large and talented musical establishment, and the music of her court was a key part of the flourishing of the arts during her reign. It was a way of demonstrating that England was a major cultural power, on par with France or Spain. The music wasn't just entertainment. It was propaganda for the Tudor dynasty, and the Queen was its conductor. Number 16, could bad handwriting topple a throne? In 1586, letters written by Mary, Queen of Scots, were intercepted. Her distinctive, elegant handwriting was a key piece of evidence used to implicate her in a plot against Queen Elizabeth I, leading directly to her execution. A single misplaced document from a queen's private desk could be copied and distributed by spies within hours. Calligraphy was more than just pretty handwriting for a queen. It was a matter of security, authority, and personal branding. In an age before typewriters and digital signatures, a queen's own hand was her primary tool for communicating her will. Every letter to a foreign monarch, every signed decree, every private note was a direct extension of her power. And it had to be perfect. First, a queen's handwriting had to be clear and legible. This sounds basic, but it was crucial. A misunderstood command or a misread treaty clause could have disastrous consequences. A queen's orders to a general on a battlefield or her instructions to an ambassador had to be completely unambiguous. Her scribes and secretaries could write most official documents, but the most important ones, especially personal letters to other rulers, had to come from the queen herself. A clear, controlled hand demonstrated a clear, controlled mind. Second, her script had to be distinctive and difficult to forge. A queen's signature was the seal of ultimate authority. It turned a piece of paper into law. Forgers were everywhere, and a plausible forgery could be used to grant lands, pardon criminals, or even declare war. Queens often developed a unique and complex style of writing with specific flourishes and ligatures that acted as a form of security. Elizabeth, I had a particularly famous and intricate signature that was incredibly difficult to copy. Her handwriting was a form of currency, and she protected it as fiercely as she protected her treasury. Third, the style of a queen's handwriting was a statement of her education and status. There were different styles of script associated with different social classes and levels of education. And a queen was expected to have mastered a fine, elegant, italic hand, which was associated with the humanist learning of the Renaissance. A clumsy or unformed script would have been seen as a sign of a poor education and a lack of refinement. Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day Queen of England, was a renowned scholar. Her beautiful, precise handwriting was a testament to her classical education and was often commented on by her contemporaries. It was part of what made her seem a suitable, if tragic, candidate for the throne. Finally, the act of writing itself was a core part of a queen's daily work. She was the head of a vast administration. She spent hours a day reading and responding to correspondence. She had to be able to write quickly and efficiently, often in several languages. This was not a delicate hobby. It was the hard, grinding work of governance. The pen was her primary tool of statecraft, and her skill in wielding it was as important as a king's skill with a sword. Number 15. Why did a queen need to know more about God than a priest? The Act of Supremacy in 1534 declared the King of England the head of the church. This meant that theological arguments were no longer just for churchmen. They were matters of state policy and treason. A queen consort who held the wrong religious views, like Catherine of Aragon, could find herself and her child declared illegitimate. For a queen, navigating religious doctrine was like walking through a minefield. Religion wasn't a matter of private faith. It was the foundation of her legitimacy, the justification for her power, and the most common cause of war and rebellion. A queen who did not have a deep, sophisticated understanding of theology was at a severe disadvantage. She could be easily trapped by cunning bishops, outmaneuvered by her council, or seen as impious by her people. A queen had to be able to defend her own religious position and that of her husband's kingdom with intelligence and eloquence. This was especially true during the Reformation, when Europe was torn apart by religious conflict. A queen was often a key figure in these struggles. Catherine Parr, the sixth wife of Henry V, was a devout Protestant reformer. She wrote and published her own religious books, a radical act for a woman at the time. She engaged in theological debates with Henry himself. Her deep knowledge of scripture and Protestant doctrine allowed her to hold her own and promote her cause. However, it also put her in immense danger. Her enemies at court tried to use her religious views to have her arrested for heresy. She only survived by making a clever, submissive appeal to the king, arguing that she only debated with him to learn from his great wisdom. The queens also acted as mediators and peacemakers in religious disputes. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, ruled during a time of brutal religious wars between Catholics and Huguenots. She spent years trying to find a compromise. This required a profound understanding of the theological differences between the two sides. She had to know what points were non-negotiable and where there might be room for agreement. She organized colloquies and debates, bringing theologians from both sides together. Her efforts were ultimately unsuccessful, but her deep engagement with the religious issues of her day shows how central this knowledge was to the job of a ruler. She couldn't just tell them to stop fighting. She had to understand why they were fighting. Finally, a queen's personal piety was a matter of public performance. She was expected to be a model of Christian virtue for her people. This meant attending long church services, understanding complex sermons, and being able to discuss scripture with visiting clergy. A queen who seemed bored or ignorant during religious ceremonies could spark rumors of heresy or atheism. Her every action was scrutinized for signs of proper devotion. This required not just faith, but also the intellectual stamina to engage with complex theological ideas on a daily basis. For a queen, a deep knowledge of religion wasn't just about saving her soul, it was about saving her crown. Number 14, was a queen more of a CEO than a royal? The household of a medieval or early modern queen was not a home. It was a massive corporation. The queen's household could have over 1,200 salaried employees. Its annual budget could rival that of a major government department. A single feast could require the procurement of thousands of birds, hundreds of barrels of wine, and spices worth more than their weight in gold. Managing this vast enterprise was one of the most complex and critical jobs a queen had. If she failed, the consequences were not just a badly run house. It could lead to debt, political instability, and a loss of prestige. A queen had to be a skilled administrator, a shrewd financial manager, and a tough negotiator. The first challenge was personnel. A queen was in charge of a huge staff, from the high-ranking ladies in waiting, who were often the daughters of powerful nobles, down to the laundry maids and stable boys. She had to manage their appointments, their salaries, their duties, and their quarrels. Appointing someone to a position in her household was a major political act. It was a way to grant patronage and secure the loyalty of a family. A queen had to balance the competing demands of different noble factions, all of whom wanted their relatives placed in positions of influence close to her. A misstep could create a bitter enemy. She had to be a master of human resources in a very high-stakes environment. Then there was the budget. The queen's household was funded by her own lands and revenues, and it was expected to be a showpiece of royal splendor. But the costs were astronomical. A queen had to track expenses, negotiate with suppliers, and ensure that the household did not fall into debt. A queen who was seen as a spendthrift, like Marie Antoinette, could face public anger and political backlash. A queen who was too frugal, however, could be seen as miserly, failing to uphold the dignity of the crown. It was a delicate balancing act. She had to project an image of effortless magnificence while keeping a tight grip on the purse strings. This required a head for numbers and a detailed understanding of logistics, from the price of candles to the cost of fodder for the horses. The queen's household was also the center of her political power. It was her court within the larger court. The people who served her were her eyes and ears. They brought her information, carried her messages, and formed the core of her political faction. A well-run household was a loyal and efficient political machine. A poorly run one, full of spies and rivalries, could be a source of constant danger. A queen had to command the loyalty and respect of her staff. She had to be the undisputed head of her own small kingdom within the palace walls. This was not a job for a figurehead. It was a demanding, hands-on management role that required constant vigilance and a keen understanding of power. Number 13, why was it more dangerous to accept a gift than to give one? A gift of a rare falcon from a foreign prince could be a gesture of friendship, or it could be a subtle demand for a military alliance. The cost of maintaining the horses gifted to Queen Elizabeth I by her courtiers exceeded the annual income of a wealthy knight. Refusing a gift from a powerful noble was a public insult that could fester into treason. Gift-giving in a royal court was a complex and dangerous game of strategy. For a queen, it was a primary tool for building alliances, rewarding loyalty, and displaying power. But every gift given or received was loaded with hidden meaning and potential consequences. Mastering this system was essential for survival. As a recipient of gifts, a queen was a constant target. Nobles and ambassadors showered her with presents, but these were rarely acts of simple generosity. A gift was an investment. It created an obligation. The person who gave the gift expected something in return: a promotion, a land grant, a favorable trade deal. A queen had to be able to read the true intention behind every present. Was this a simple token of loyalty, or was it a bribe? Accepting a gift meant tacitly accepting the relationship and the obligation that came with it. She had to keep a mental ledger of who had given her what, and what they likely wanted in return. To accept too much from one faction was to alienate all the others, and to refuse a gift was to cause deep offense. The only safe path was to accept graciously, but to make no immediate promises, adding the gift to the complex political calculus she ran in her head at all times. As a giver of gifts, a queen wielded immense power. Patronage was the glue that held the court together, and the queen was a major source of it. By giving a gift, a jewel, a pension, an office, she could turn a potential rival into a loyal supporter. The value of the gift had to be carefully calibrated. A gift that was too small would be seen as an insult. A gift that was too large could be seen as a sign of weakness or desperation. Elizabeth, I was famous for her New Year's gift exchange. It was a highly ritualized ceremony where she received gifts from her courtiers and gave them gifts in return. The value of the gift she gave was a clear and public signal of a courtier's standing. To receive a fine piece of silver plate from the queen meant you were in favor. To receive a lesser gift was a sign that your star was falling. She used these gifts to manage her court, finely tuning the hierarchy and keeping her ambitious nobles in a constant state of competition for her favor. The gifts themselves could be a form of communication. Giving a courtier a book of Protestant theology was a clear signal of the queen's religious leanings and an encouragement for them to follow suit. Giving an ambassador a portrait of herself was a standard part of diplomatic exchange, a way of creating a personal connection between rulers. The entire system was a language of objects, and a queen had to be fluent in it. A mistake could be costly, turning a friend into an enemy, or accidentally promising something she had no intention of delivering. Number 12, could a queen learn more from a gardener than from a general? The personal physician to King James, I believe that tomatoes were poisonous. Many court doctors in the 17th century still relied on the theory of the four humors, a medical concept from ancient Greece. A queen who entrusted her health and the health of her children entirely to these men was taking a huge risk. Knowledge of botany and herbalism was a crucial and often secret skill for a queen. In an era of primitive and often dangerous medicine, a queen's ability to understand plants and their properties could be a matter of life and death. This wasn't about folk remedies. It was about self-preservation, control over her own body, and the protection of her children, the heirs to the throne. Childbirth was the most dangerous time in a queen's life. The risk of infection and death was terrifyingly high. Royal physicians often had little practical experience with childbirth, which was traditionally the domain of midwives. A queen with knowledge of herbal remedies could have more control over her own care. She would know which herbs could ease pain, which could help stop bleeding, and which could aid in recovery. Many queens maintained their own private gardens and still rooms where they could distill medicines and prepare their own remedies. This gave them a degree of autonomy from the often unreliable court doctors. It was a way of taking her health and the future of the dynasty into her own hands. This knowledge was also essential for protecting her family. Childhood illnesses were rampant and infant mortality was high. A queen was the primary caretaker of her young children. Her understanding of simple herbal treatments for fevers, coughs, and digestive problems could make the difference between a mild illness and a fatal one. Catherine de' Medici was known for her interest in botany. While her enemies used this to spread dark rumors about her knowledge of poisons, it was also a reflection of her responsibility as a mother to 10 children. She needed to be a skilled nurse and pharmacist to keep them alive. There was also a darker side to this knowledge. While a queen needed to know about healing herbs, she also needed to be aware of poisonous ones. Poison was a constant fear in royal courts. A queen who understood the effects of different plants was better equipped to recognize the symptoms of poisoning in herself or others. She would know what to look for, and she might even know potential antidotes. This knowledge was a form of defense. It armed her against one of the most insidious threats of court life. The same knowledge that could be used to heal could also be used to harm, and a wise queen understood that she needed to know as much as her enemies did in order to protect herself. Her garden was not just a place of beauty, it was an arsenal and a pharmacy. Number 11, why was being a good listener more powerful than giving a great speech? The Spanish ambassador to the English court in the 1560s, de Silva, filed reports that were often over 10,000 words long, detailing every conversation, rumor, and perceived slight he witnessed. He was just one of dozens of diplomats and spies operating at court. A queen was under constant surveillance. In a world where every wall had ears, a queen had to master the art of information management. This wasn't just about having spies. It was a more subtle and complex skill set. It involved becoming a master of listening, of reading people, and of carefully controlling the flow of information that swirled around the throne. The most important skill was the ability to listen. Not just to the words people were saying, but to what they weren't saying. A queen would spend hours every day in audiences, receiving courtiers, ambassadors, and petitioners. Much of what they said was flattery and formula, but a skilled queen could pick up on the subtle cues, a hesitation in an answer, a glance between two nobles, a rumor mentioned as a jest. These were the real pieces of information. She had to have the mental discipline to filter out the noise and identify the signals. Catherine the Great of Russia was a prodigious letter writer, but she was also known for her ability to listen intently in council, letting her ambitious ministers talk themselves out, revealing their true motives and rivalries in the process. A queen also had to be a brilliant reader of people. She had to assess a person's character, ambition, and loyalty in a matter of minutes. Was this courtier a genuine supporter? Or were they trying to advance their own family's interests? Was this ambassador telling the truth, or were they feeding her misinformation? This was a skill honed through thousands of interactions. It was an intuitive understanding of human nature, built on experience and a healthy dose of suspicion. A queen who was a poor judge of character would quickly find herself surrounded by traitors and flatterers. Finally, a queen had to be the master of her own information. She had to decide what to reveal, what to conceal, and what to leak. She could plant a rumor with a talkative lady in waiting to see how it spread and who it reached. She could feign ignorance on a topic to encourage others to speak freely. She could share a piece of false information with a suspected spy to see if it got back to a rival court. This was a constant, high-stakes information war. Elizabeth I was a genius at this. She was famously ambiguous and kept her own counsel. Even her closest advisors were often unsure of her true intentions. This kept everyone guessing. It made it impossible for factions to form against a clear policy because the policy was never entirely clear until the moment it was enacted. By controlling the information, she controlled the conversation, and by controlling the conversation, she controlled the court. Number 10. How could a queen go bankrupt while living in a palace? Isabella of Castile pawned her own crown jewels to help fund Christopher Columbus's voyage. Queen Marie Antoinette was given an allowance for her personal expenses. The pin money, that was enormous, yet she was constantly in debt due to gambling and extravagance, a fact used against her by her enemies. A queen's finances were a tangled mess of personal wealth, state funds, and customary rights. She was expected to live in splendor, but she often had limited control over her own income. Mastering the art of debt management, both personal and political profit, was a hidden but vital skill for her survival and influence. A queen's personal finances were a constant challenge. Her income often came from a specific set of lands granted to her as part of her marriage settlement. She had to manage these estates, collect the rents, and pay for her entire household from that income. This made her effectively the CEO of a large agricultural and real estate enterprise. If the harvests were bad or the tenants didn't pay, her income would plummet. But the expectation of magnificence never changed. She still had to pay for her gowns, her staff, and the lavish gifts she was expected to give. A queen who couldn't manage her own lands and budget would quickly fall into debt, and debt was a sign of weakness and poor management. Furthermore, debt was a tool of political control. A queen who owed money to a powerful noble or a group of bankers was beholden to them. They could use her debt to pressure her for political favors. To remain independent, a queen had to be financially solvent. This meant being shrewd. It meant knowing which of her lands were most profitable, hiring good administrators, and having the courage to cut expenses, even if it meant appearing less magnificent than she would like. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a master of this. She was one of the wealthiest women in Europe, but her wealth came from her vast lands in France. She managed them skillfully, even while she was Queen of England, ensuring a steady flow of income that gave her a degree of power and independence that few other queens enjoyed. Beyond her personal accounts, a queen was also deeply involved in the murky world of political debt. This wasn't about money, but about favors. Every appointment she secured for a supporter, every pardon she begged from the king, every honor she bestowed created a debt. The recipient owed her their loyalty. A skillful queen built up a vast network of people who were in her debt. This was her political capital. When she needed to pass a measure in the council, or when she needed support against a rival, she would call in these debts. She had to keep a precise mental record of this complex web of obligations. Who owed her? What did they owe her for? And when was the right time to collect? It was a far more complex ledger than any financial account book, and her ability to manage it was a direct measure of her political power. Number 9, why was ignoring an insult a sign of strength? In a royal court, a direct confrontation was rare. Insults were delivered with a smile, in the form of a backhanded compliment or a seemingly innocent question. A courtier might praise a queen's gown by saying it was surprisingly fashionable for someone of her age. The public nature of this comment meant the queen had to react, but reacting with anger would make her seem weak and uncontrolled. Selective deafness was a survival tactic. A queen was the subject of constant gossip, criticism, and veiled insults. If she reacted to every single one, she would be in a perpetual state of rage and would quickly lose the respect of her court. She had to develop the ability to consciously choose what to hear and what to ignore. It was a form of emotional armor. This skill was most important in public. In the throne room or at a state banquet, a queen was on display. Her every reaction was noted. If a noble made a sly comment and the queen flushed with anger or shot back a sharp reply, she had lost. She had shown that the comment had affected her. She had let a lesser person control her emotions. The powerful move was to show no reaction at all, to smile serenely as if the comment was a genuine compliment, or to simply appear not to have heard it. This demonstrated immense self-control. It told the court that she was above such petty games. It was a non-verbal way of saying, "Your words have no power over me." Catherine de' Medici faced constant insults at the French court. She was an Italian, a merchant's daughter, in a court that prized ancient French lineage. She was criticized for her accent, her entourage, and her political maneuvering. Had she fought back against every slur, she would have been exhausted and ineffective. Instead, she developed a reputation for being inscrutable. Her calm, placid expression gave nothing away. She listened, she watched, and she let the insults wash over her. Her power came not from trading barbs, but from outlasting and outmaneuvering her enemies, many of whom underestimated her because they mistook her silence for weakness. This wasn't about being a pushover. Selective deafness was a strategic choice, not a passive one. A queen would absolutely remember the insult and the person who delivered it. She would file it away. The information was valuable. It told her who her enemies were, but she would choose the time and place for her response. Her revenge would not be a shouted retort in a crowded room. It would be a quiet refusal of a petition months later, or the promotion of the insulter's rival. By not reacting in the moment, she retained all the power. She controlled the terms of the conflict. The courtier who thought they had scored a point with a clever insult would only realize they had made a fatal mistake when their career mysteriously stalled, with no one to blame but their own foolishness. Number 8, how could sitting still for hours save your life? A formal state dinner in the 17th century could have over 20 courses and last for more than 5 hours. A queen was expected to sit through the entire event, looking regal and engaged, without fidgeting or showing signs of boredom or fatigue. A portrait sitting for a major artist like Holbein could require the subject to hold the same pose for days on end. The mastery of stillness was a physical and mental discipline that was surprisingly critical for a queen. In a world of rigid ceremony and constant public scrutiny, her ability to control her own body was a direct expression of her power and authority. This was not about relaxation, it was about projecting an aura of unshakable calm and endurance. Ceremonies were the theater of monarchy. Coronations, royal weddings, state funerals, religious services. These events could go on for an entire day. The queen was the central figure. Thousands of eyes were on her. If she looked tired or bored or uncomfortable, it weakened the entire spectacle. It made the monarchy look human and fallible. A queen had to train herself to sit or stand for immense periods, maintaining perfect posture, a serene expression on her face. This physical stamina was a symbol of her political stamina. It showed she had the fortitude to rule. Any sign of weakness was dangerous. Portraiture was another area where stillness was key. Royal portraits were not just artworks. They were a vital form of political propaganda. They were sent to other courts as part of marriage negotiations and distributed throughout the kingdom to create an image of the ruler. The process of creating these portraits was grueling. A queen had to wear heavy, uncomfortable robes and hold a specific pose, often for hours at a time, day after day. The final image had to be one of majesty and power. A queen who couldn't endure the sittings would not get a good portrait, and a bad portrait was a political liability. The steady gaze and calm demeanor of Queen Elizabeth I in her portraits were not just an artist's invention. They were a reflection of her own incredible self-discipline, honed over countless hours of holding still. This skill extended to her daily life in court. When holding audience or presiding over the council, a queen's body language was a constant broadcast of her authority. By remaining still and composed while others talked, she projected an image of calm control. She was the quiet center of the storm. Courtiers who fidgeted, whispered, or showed impatience appeared less serious, less powerful. The queen's stillness gave her an air of gravitas and made her seem more thoughtful and judicious. It was a non-verbal way of asserting her dominance in any room she was in. It was a physical manifestation of the idea that while others might be moved by passions and anxieties, the monarch was constant and unshakable. Number 6, why was a secret code more important than a strong army? In 1587, the Babington plot against Queen Elizabeth I was unraveled primarily because her spymaster, Francis Walsingham, was able to intercept and decipher the conspirators' coded letters. The messages, which directly implicated Mary, Queen of Scots, were written using a complex substitution cipher. For a queen, diplomacy and intrigue were constant companions. Her personal letters to other monarchs, her instructions to ambassadors, and her orders to spies were high-value targets. A single intercepted letter could reveal a military strategy, expose a secret alliance, or provide the pretext for war. To survive this world of espionage, a queen needed to understand the art of cryptography. This wasn't a skill she could delegate entirely to her spymasters. She had to have a working knowledge of how ciphers were constructed and how they were broken. This was essential for her own security. She needed to be able to assess whether the codes being used by her own government were strong enough. She also needed to be able to write or read a coded message herself in a pinch without relying on a secretary who could be a spy. Mary, Queen of Scots, was an avid user of ciphers. She believed her communications were secure. Her fatal mistake was underestimating the skill of Elizabeth's codebreakers. She used a cipher that was complex, but not complex enough, and it cost her her life. Understanding cryptography also gave a queen a significant advantage in foreign policy. By funding and directing efforts to break the codes of other nations, she could gain invaluable intelligence. She could learn about her rivals' plans before they happened. She could discover secret negotiations between her enemies. This was a hidden but immensely powerful tool of statecraft. Elizabeth I's government invested heavily in code breaking. Her ability to read the correspondence of the Spanish ambassador gave her a massive advantage in the long Cold War with Spain. She often knew what Philip II was planning before his own commanders did. The use of codes also extended to more personal and subtle forms of communication within the court. Lovers and political conspirators used simple ciphers to communicate. A queen needed to be aware of these methods. The language of flowers, where different flowers carried specific meanings, was a form of code. So were the messages that could be sent by the way a fan was held or a handkerchief was dropped. A queen had to be literate in all these secret languages. It was part of the constant effort to gather information and protect herself from plots. In the silent, deadly game of court intrigue, the person who could read the secret messages was the one who survived. Number 5, how could stamina be a political weapon? A coronation ceremony for a medieval monarch could last for over 8 hours, involving multiple changes of clothing, long processions, and a lengthy church service, all while wearing a crown that could weigh over 5 pounds. A single court ball could last from dusk until dawn, and a queen was expected to be the last one to leave. Physical stamina was not a footnote in a queen's job description. It was a core requirement. The life of a queen was a marathon of public performance, and any sign of fatigue was interpreted as a sign of weakness in her ability to rule. She had to possess an almost superhuman level of endurance simply to get through the daily calendar of a monarch. The court's schedule was relentless. It started early and ended late. A queen would spend her days in council meetings, giving audiences, dealing with correspondence, and then her evenings at banquets, masques, and balls. These were not optional social events. They were a critical part of the job. It was during these long evenings that much of the informal business of the court was done. A queen who retired early missed out on crucial conversations and opportunities to build relationships. To endure this schedule, day after day, year after year, required incredible physical resilience. This endurance was also a key part of her public image. The monarch was supposed to be more than human. They were God's chosen representative on earth. To see a queen tire or falter during a long ceremony would shatter this illusion. It would make her seem merely mortal. Catherine the Great was known for her incredible energy. She would rise at 5 in the morning, work for hours on state papers, and still have the stamina to attend court functions late into the night. Her tireless work ethic became part of her legend. It projected an image of a ruler who was completely in command, both of herself and of her empire. This stamina was especially crucial when a queen had to travel. Royal progresses, where the monarch and her entire court traveled through the kingdom, were grueling affairs. They could last for months, covering hundreds of miles on horseback or in uncomfortable carriages. The queen was expected to be on display the entire time, looking radiant and majestic for her subjects. Isabella of Castile was famous for the speed and distance she could cover on horseback, often traveling with her armies. This physical toughness earned her the respect of her soldiers and nobles. It showed that she was not a distant ruler in a palace, but a leader who shared the hardships of her people. Her ability to endure was a powerful political statement, a physical guarantee of her commitment and strength. Number 4, why was speaking another language a matter of national security? When Catherine the Great, a German princess, arrived in Russia to marry the heir, she barely spoke a word of Russian. She immediately began a crash course, studying so hard that she would get up in the middle of the night to pace her room and practice her vocabulary. She knew that to rule Russia, she had to speak its language. For a queen, especially a foreign-born one, mastering languages was not an academic exercise. It was a fundamental tool of survival, diplomacy, and political integration. A queen who could not speak the language of her new country was isolated. A queen who could speak many languages was a formidable international player. First and foremost, speaking the language of her adopted kingdom was essential for a queen to win over her people and her court. A queen who relied on translators was always at a disadvantage. She could never be sure if her words were being conveyed accurately. She couldn't have private conversations. She would always be an outsider, the foreign queen. By learning the language, she showed respect for her new country's culture. It was a bridge to her subjects and a way to build personal relationships with the powerful nobles at court. Catherine the Great's dedication to learning Russian was a key factor in her eventual success. It allowed her to connect with the Russian guards and nobility who would later support her in overthrowing her unpopular German-speaking husband. Beyond the language of her own court, A queen needed to be a polyglot to be effective on the international stage. Latin was the language of the church and scholarship. French was the language of diplomacy. A queen who could converse directly with a foreign ambassador in his own tongue without a translator had a huge advantage. The conversation was more nuanced, more private, and more direct. She could pick up on subtleties that a translator might miss. She could build a personal rapport. Queen Elizabeth I was a gifted linguist. She was fluent in Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish, and had a working knowledge of Greek and Welsh. This was a powerful diplomatic weapon. When she addressed her troops at Tilbury, she did so in powerful, direct English. But when she negotiated with foreign ambassadors, she could switch effortlessly to their own language, impressing them with her intellect and putting them at a disadvantage. Languages were also crucial for intelligence gathering. A queen who could read a letter in another language might be the first to learn of a secret plan. She could understand intercepted correspondence without having to trust it to a translator who might be a spy. It gave her an extra layer of security and a direct line to raw information. In the complex world of European politics, where kingdoms were linked by a tangled web of marriages and alliances, being able to navigate the different languages of the continent was not a luxury. It was a necessity for any ruler who wanted to be a player and not just a pawn in the great game. Number 3, could a queen's true feelings ever be her own? Charles I of England was executed in 1649. His wife Henrietta Maria was in exile in France. Upon hearing the news, she collapsed, remaining in a state of shock for hours. Her public display of grief was real, but for a queen, even the most private emotions were public and political. The most demanding and constant skill a queen had to master was radical emotional regulation. She lived her life on a public stage. Her face was a political landscape scrutinized by everyone for clues to her thoughts and the state of the kingdom. To show the wrong emotion at the wrong time could be catastrophic. She had to become a master actress, capable of completely detaching her inner feelings from her outward expression. A queen could not afford to show fear. When the Spanish Armada was threatening England, Elizabeth I had to project an image of absolute confidence and resolve, even if she was privately terrified. Her famous speech to the troops at Tilbury was a masterclass in this. She presented herself as a strong and fearless leader, inspiring her army. Any hint of doubt on her part would have spread panic. She could not afford to show too much anger. A flash of temper might be forgiven in a king, but in a queen, it was often seen as hysteria or a sign of being emotionally unstable and unfit to rule. When she was angry, she had to channel it into cold, calculated political moves, not into public outbursts. She had to maintain a mask of calm composure, even when dealing with traitors or incompetent ministers. She could not afford to show too much personal affection. Favoritism was a cancer in a royal court. If a queen was seen to be too close to one particular courtier or lady in waiting, it would breed jealousy and resentment among all the others. She had to be warm and gracious to many, but truly intimate with almost no one. Her personal friendships were always subordinate to her political needs. Even her grief was not her own. When a royal child died, a queen was expected to grieve, but she had to do it in a way that was seen as dignified and royal. Too much public wailing could be seen as a loss of control. Too little could be seen as cold and heartless. She had to perform her sorrow in a way that met the expectations of the court and her people. This constant self-monitoring was an immense psychological burden. A queen had very few people, if any, with whom she could be truly herself. She was always on duty. The ability to smile when she was furious, to look serene when she was anxious, and to be gracious to people she despised was not a sign of being fake. It was a core professional skill. It was the emotional armor she had to wear every single day to survive the relentless pressure cooker of the court. Number 2, why was remembering a person's name a life or death skill? The court of Louis XIV at Versailles had over 10,000 people living in or working near the palace. A high-ranking noble might have dozens of distant cousins, all of whom expected to be recognized by the monarch. Forgetting a name wasn't just a social blunder, it was a political one. It signaled that the person was insignificant. An encyclopedic memory was a queen's secret weapon. It wasn't about memorizing dates or treaties, though that was important too. It was about memorizing people. A queen had to be a walking database of faces, names, family connections, political allegiances, past favors, and old grudges. This information was the currency of court politics, and a queen who could access it instantly had a tremendous advantage. When a courtier approached the queen, she had seconds to recall everything about them. "Ah, Lord Buckingham," she might say, "I was so pleased to hear of your daughter's recent marriage to the son of the Duke of Norfolk. And how is your cousin, the one who served so bravely in the Irish campaign?" In one sentence, she has demonstrated that she knows who he is. She is aware of his family's strategic alliances, and she remembers their history of loyal service. This personal touch made the courtier feel seen and valued. It built a powerful bond of loyalty. It made them feel that they were not just another face in the crowd, but someone who mattered to the queen. Conversely, a failure of memory could be a disaster. To mistake one noble for another, or to forget a major event in their family's life, was a grave insult. It implied they were unimportant. In a court full of proud and ambitious people, such a slight would not be forgotten. It could turn a potential ally into a resentful enemy. The courtier would feel diminished and their loyalty would waver. A queen couldn't afford to create enemies through simple carelessness. This memory had to extend beyond her own court. She needed to know the complex family trees of all the other royal houses in Europe. Who was related to whom? What were the old rivalries between the Spanish Habsburgs and the French Valois? This knowledge was essential for diplomacy and for arranging strategic marriages for her children. A marriage was a political alliance, and a queen had to understand the intricate web of relationships to make the right choice. This wasn't a natural talent. It was a skill that had to be cultivated and practiced. Queens would have their ladies-in-waiting or secretaries brief them before major events, drilling them on the names and backgrounds of the people they were about to meet. They had to actively work to commit thousands of details to memory. It was an invisible but exhausting part of their job. The queen who could recall a small detail from a conversation a year ago was seen as sharp and engaged. The one who couldn't was seen as aloof, or, even worse, incompetent. Her memory was a direct measure of her political skill. Number one, what was the most important thing a queen could ever produce? For centuries, the primary and often sole purpose of a queen consort was brutally simple. It wasn't to rule, advise, or inspire. It was to give birth, specifically to give birth to a healthy male heir. All her other skills, her intelligence, her linguistic abilities, her political acumen, were secondary to this one biological function. The failure to produce an heir, or the failure to produce a son, was the single greatest threat to her position and, sometimes, her life. This immense pressure shaped every aspect of a queen's existence. From the moment she was married, often as a teenager, she lived under a relentless public watch. Her monthly cycles were a matter of state concern, tracked and discussed by ministers and ambassadors. If she became pregnant, the entire kingdom celebrated. But the 9 months that followed were filled with anxiety. A miscarriage was not just a personal tragedy, it was a national crisis. The queen would be blamed, her body seen as having failed in its duty. The birth itself was a public event. Key officials and nobles would be present in the birthing chamber to witness the event and verify the child's legitimacy. The queen had no privacy in her most vulnerable moments. If the child was a girl, there was polite disappointment. She had done half the job. She would be expected to try again immediately. If the child was a boy, there was national rejoicing. The queen, for that moment, was a hero. She had secured the dynasty. The story of Henry V's wives is the most stark example of this reality. Catherine of Aragon was a skilled and intelligent queen, a capable regent who was respected throughout Europe. But after 20 years of marriage, she had only produced one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. This failure gave Henry the pretext to annul their marriage, break with the Catholic Church, and cast her aside. Her replacement, Anne Boleyn, charmed the king with her wit and style. But when she too produced only a daughter, Elizabeth, her fate was sealed. Her inability to deliver a son was a key reason her enemies were able to convince the king to have her executed on trumped-up charges. Jane Seymour, his third wife, was briefly triumphant. She gave Henry the son he craved, Edward. She died shortly after, but she died having succeeded in her one essential task. This biological imperative was the cruelest and most unexpected skill a queen had to master the complete surrender of her own body to the needs of the state. She had little control over this process, yet she was held entirely responsible for its outcome. Her value, her power, and her very survival depended not on her character or her abilities, but on the roll of the genetic dice in her womb. It was the ultimate unfair test, and it haunted the lives of royal women for 1,000 years. The crown was heavy, but the weight of this expectation was heavier still.